Ooh, our shirts match the color of. Oh, we're live. But we do. You're green in the green chair, and I'm like red in the red chair. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for many, many reasons. That's our catchphrase. Motto? Slogan?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Not really a catchphrase. I don't say it a lot. With me today is Ross Sweet, a good friend of mine. Dr. Ross Sweet. We debated whether to put that in his name on the thing because, well, why don't you tell them a bit about who you are and what you do?
So I am an assistant professor of mathematics at a small liberal arts school in Iowa, Simpson College. I focus a lot on teaching and learning, which is why I'm at a place like Simpson rather than a larger research institute.
I'm excited to learn more about that. So yes, a doctor of numbers, basically.
No. I don't use numbers so much anymore.
That's actually a long-running joke. So Ross and I are best friends. Ross and his wife and my wife and I have been good friends for many years. Our wives actually went to high school together. But a long-running joke of ours has been that whenever someone's adding or subtracting or whatever, and I say, oh, that's math, that Ross will sometimes say, that's not math, that's arithmetic. But yeah, we're here, and just to refresh anybody, I know some of you are here already. Hello in the comments. All we're doing is Q&A. We're having a conversation, and that conversation will be impacted and guided and shaped by the things that you guys say in the comments. So questions are great, and comments are great, and really just the more that you participate, the more what we do is going to be shaped by what you're looking for, right? Of course, again, remember, not therapy, although we talk about things that may or may not have therapeutic benefit for individuals. And I don't really know what we're going to talk about today, unless people put things in the chat. We're just probably going to delve into things and be, I'm guessing, more like theoretical and philosophical, because that's fun to me.
Yeah, that's my jam.
But actually, so I'm taking advantage of this as an opportunity to learn more about your work, like the specifics of it. I know like the broad strokes, but I know that we've talked before about your, and you just mentioned again, specifically focused on like math education, and that you have like really like specific beliefs that you're passionate about. And I have the impression, although I don't know this is true, that some of that is like that there are things that are commonly done or typically done that you think could be or should be done differently. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think math, and probably higher ed in general, I don't just want to pick on math here.
Yeah.
But higher ed in general has been very slow to catch on to advances in learning sciences that have been known in K-12 education for very, very long periods of time.
Yeah.
So that's why you see things in higher education like the standard model for actually delivering information in a class is through lecture. So students are sort of passively receiving information in a class. Whereas, if you look at what's been done in research in learning sciences, especially in the context of K-12 education, people have known for a very long time that that's not how people learn.
Yeah.
And so, there's been a concerted effort for a while now to get higher education sort of more aligned with how people actually learn rather than what's comfortable for us as educators, because that's the system that we came up in and we excelled in. So it's almost ingrained in us that like this is how a college class is supposed to go.
Yeah.
Frankly, it's kind of the easiest way to teach because I don't have to worry about what the students are doing. I can just get up there and talk and like listen to my genius, everyone.
And if you don't get it, then it's your fault. You're doing something wrong, student.
Yeah, and I hear that from faculty who kind of have this mindset, like, I just got out of a class, I dragged my students kicking and screaming through this one theorem and this one long proof that took an hour. I'm like, in my head, I'm thinking, well, did the students actually learn anything in that context? Or were you just saying, here's how smart I am because I know how to prove this statement?
Yeah.
I think that happens a lot. And
plus some ticking the boxes on like, this is curriculum that I'm required to get through, or is that not as much a case in the higher education as in K-12?
It kind of depends. In a lot of lower level courses, 100 level courses, certainly you're checking boxes, because especially in math, we're often viewed as a service department in that we teach classes that are required for a lot of other programs. So if you think about, a big research institute, the calculus classes or college algebra, those introductory statistics courses, those are courses that are required for, maybe not so much pre-med anymore, because pre-med has moved away from requiring calculus. But things like engineering, chemistry, physics, a lot of the natural sciences, hard sciences, if you're doing more statistical work in psychology, you certainly need a background in calculus and the more advanced statistics.
So when you say a service department, you mean like that implies that the function of that department is to serve people in pursuit of other degrees?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I have never heard that term before.
We are teaching courses that serve other programs other than just our own.
Is that like an actual designation or just like a colloquial way of?
No, it's a colloquial way, but generally one that is used sort of up the hierarchy in higher education through, from faculty up through administration.
Yeah. See, I have like a lot of thoughts about higher education.
Obviously.
I do too. And I've always like been fascinated to get into that stuff with you, because obviously I don't have the knowledge or firsthand experience that you have with it. But it's hard to be a part of a system. Well, like therapy, a lot of the problems that you're talking about are problems that therapy has as well. Like the very concept of client resistance is nonsense. Like, what does that mean other than I did everything right and the client still didn't like it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's hard to be part of a system that like you see all the flaws of, but not wanting to like get out of that system because there's work to be done to work on like changing and improving it. It's a tricky balance, I think, to ride. Like, how do you manage, especially for you, because you're part of a large, I mean, I know it's not large like a large research university, but a large institution with a lot of bureaucracy and oversight and all that kind of stuff. How do you manage being critical and aware and working towards improvement without costing too much?
I mean, you have to think about it in different levels, right? So the things that I have direct control over, my classrooms. I have direct control over how I approach teaching and learning in my classes. By and large, I have a very significant amount of control over the actual curriculum that I teach. That's one of the nice things about being at a smaller institution is there are less sort of strict requirements on, here are the things that you have to cover in this class. Things can be a little bit more malleable, which is great because that allows you to meet the students more where they are and think about what their needs are, rather than, I have this lecture hall of 400 students. Here are all the things that, again, I'm going to drag you kicking and screaming through.
Yeah.
So they're the things that you have direct control over, and those are the things that you certainly have the most. That's where your sort of like main focus is most of the time, just in your working life. And so that's where you can really directly affect change. But then you can think about how that interacts with systems as you sort of move up the hierarchy, and there, of course, things start to move slower and slower and slower.
Right.
But through things like the idea of faculty shared governance, in an ideal world, we have the ability to exert control over what the college does and what the college policies are toward things like, issues of equity in the classroom. That's certainly a big issue right now.
This is such like it's strange to be talking with you, and I'm like trying to be mindful of keeping my face forward. Maybe I should just try and watch it in the camera because I keep wanting to turn and talk to you, but I feel like that cuts off the conversation from the people who are watching, which, by the way, just as a reminder, because I said this a few weeks ago and it seemed to have an impact. For those of you who are on Twitch, if you're talking in chat, it'll be under your Twitch name. YouTube is under your Google account and Facebook's under your Facebook account, but you can also just make up a throwaway account to use if anybody wants to ask anything but is worried about their name being attached to it. I am going to try and like watch you in the camera, which is a very weird thing to do. So I thought we would talk more about math, but now I want to talk about higher education and the problems with it.
How long do we have?
I know, right? Well, because this is like a lot, and it's relevant a lot to the people who often show up to this kind of thing, especially a lot of them are students. Somebody here whose their son is in the last year of high school. I've been thinking, I mean, a lot about education generally, but really to me, I keep coming back, especially recently, to the root of it being about the competitive nature of it.
Mm-hmm.
That I have a hard time seeing how people can justify that we, the educators, set the standards that and the metrics that we use to evaluate whether or not the students meet those standards, and are theoretically responsible for teaching and developing them so that they can meet the standards. But then if they don't meet the standards, they're the ones that take the hit. Like, they're the ones that have an F now. How do people justify that? I mean, I get how it came to be. It just existed and has stayed. But when it's challenged, how do people justify that? Because I'm assuming, I know that you don't think that way. That's the right way to go about doing it.
I don't have I think a really good answer to this question. I think one of the big things is, and this is something that I think I mentioned earlier, is that, you know, we tend to teach and continue systems that we were a part of and we were successful in. And
see, that makes sense to me. We call that intergenerational transmission in psychology, meaning that a problem presents itself, you discover a solution to the problem, and then as long as the problem no longer reoccurs, you continue the solution unless it's very costly, including that you pass it down to the next generation.
Yeah.
But people are advocating for things to be different. What is the response to that? Is it just a matter of like how costly that transition would be? Or is there like thinking behind?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on what you mean by costly, because in things like math education, this generally means like time cost. It takes a pretty good amount of time to sort of reframe how you teach and you know, essentially run a classroom.
Right.
It's hard to sort of move the focus off of you as an instructor to like the focus of that classroom being on the students.
Right.
And that takes a lot of effort and intentional work that, again, like that eats up a lot of time, and faculty in most places are pretty stressed for time.
Oh, sure.
Get pulled in a lot of directions. So I think that's one of the big ones, because material costs, honestly, not that much.
Yeah. No, I do think of it costly in those terms of like, in a sense, pulling the rug out from under people, you know, training people to be in a certain system and then saying, oops, never mind, we're doing this other thing. But in a sense, that is kind of like the same objection to people who don't want student loan forgiveness, because they're like, well, I already paid my loans. You know, it's like, just because it was worse than it could be doesn't mean we shouldn't make it better than it is, you know?
Yeah, and buy-in is a huge thing here, right? Someone who doesn't actually believe in a different modality of teaching is not going to be able to deliver that modality effectively.
But see, that's where I get stuck, is who doesn't believe in it. I can see saying, I get it, it sounds great, but it's not practical. I have a hard time seeing when people are saying like, no, this is the way that it should be.
Yeah, but even the former situation, the impact there is they're still just not going to do it.
Oh yeah,
right?
Yeah. So, of course, yeah. We talk about, actually, I want to talk to you about the accomplishment equation and pick your brain more. It's like a thing I've working or developed kind of. Cost and value. That there are things that we can find very, very valuable and still not do because they cost more than they're worth or more than we can afford, you know. And I want to call it, we got a comment there of, so tell me more about how people, you had mentioned earlier that that's not how people learn. We know that that's not, so maybe that's a good prompt for us to talk more about how people do learn.
Do you want to start?
Well, I'll give you my, like,
this is your podcast.
Sure. I'll say the like basic overview and then we can get into specifics. But effectively the most effective learning, I'm using that word. The most effective learning is literally just allowing people to pursue their interests, desires, curiosity. Like the best, most deep richest, quickest, most efficient learning happens when people are able to do literally whatever that they want to do moment to moment. As those desires shift, everything shifts with them. And that's not possible, not even theoretically possible. But the idea is we want to get as close to that as possible. And there's a lot behind why it works that way, but that's just kind of like the quick overview version. I would be interested though in like some of the research and stuff around. I mean, I know a lot of the findings that lead up to building that conclusion, but not a lot about the methodology of those studies.
Yeah. And I think maybe the short, unsatisfying answer is, in truth, like we have no idea how people learn.
Yeah, that's
like
fair.
the actual processes by which learning happens.
Yeah,
nobody knows. But like you said, we do know that engagement drives learning.
Mm-hmm.
When you are deeply engaged in a task, that is when the most learning happens.
Mm.
So when we talk about things like, going to a lecture that you are, as an audience member or a student in a classroom, a passive member of, that's not an ideal situation for learning to happen.
Yeah.
And of course that's not true sort of for every single, like you can't, extrapolate this to individuals, but just broadly speaking, this is not typically how people learn. So if you're thinking about, in a math classroom, if I want my students to learn something, I need to design tasks that are engaging and get them to ask and be put in a position to answer questions.
Mm.
So if they are able to pose questions about whatever we're talking about on that given day in a way that drives that discussion and drives the ability to actually develop the material from the ground up rather than me giving them information,
yeah,
then they are going to better retain that and understand it at a deeper level.
Yeah. I mean, so, and I said I don't know a lot of the specifics of what you do, and I don't know how much of the specifics of what I do that so we're figuring this out. But I do a lot of like modeling stuff like this to make it manipulable, right? That we take this, the brain is a black box, but we want to come up with constructs and frameworks and models that give us something to look at in order to try something different. So we can talk about these in those terms, those frameworks and models, but with the caveat that this is not like what it is. This is a way of describing it that is theoretically useful, or at least in some cases useful. Because one of the big issues here is questioning the premise of what we even mean by learning. Because most people, when they're talking about learning, what they mean is learning the specific curriculum that is being taught to a student by their, educational system, whatever that might be. So like we have terms, for example, like learning loss over the summer, or people were talking about it a lot during the remote year, or, if some people are still remote even, that they lost a lot of their learning, which is on the face of it invalid and nonsensical. You don't lose learning, you're just acquiring different information. So if we start there with looking at learning as it's a thing that the brain does at all times, as long as you're awake, like as long as you're conscious, you are learning things, as opposed to just within this like restricted narrow band of what we've deemed that you should learn. Because what you're talking about, like, and I'm sure there's like a more official term, formal term for it than this, but that empty cup theory of pedagogy, the idea that children arrive with empty minds.
Oh yeah.
And our job is to fill them up, which is just, again, I can see why people would think that. But again, obviously not true. Like children constantly are learning and developing and growing, regardless of whether anyone is intentionally trying to impart specific information. So a couple things on the engagement stuff. Number one way to look at it is that attention is a finite resource, and that the brain has, for lack of a better term, attentional algorithms that happen pre-consciously that determine what things are worth noticing and what things are not. So I've done this example for everyone, but I don't know if I've ever done it with you before, of until I say what I'm about to say 5 seconds from now, you're not actively conscious of the feeling of the chair underneath your body. And as soon as I said that, you became conscious in the moment of that feeling. That the data was always there, but those algorithms are like, yeah, this is not worth bringing into awareness because it's finite space. So engagement in one sense can be talked about as whatever I'm learning, my brain has to have a reason to learn it. And we accomplish that in education a lot by instituting arbitrary interim goals. In other words, you got to learn it because I'm going to test you on it. You got to pass the test because you're going to get a grade. But then the brain is incentivized to do literally the bare minimum. Cognitive miser is a psychological term that I don't know if it's in the education field as well, but the idea is that the brain will not spend resources unless it has a reason to do so. So for people who are intelligent, which is, we think of very differently here, but not a good thing, not a bad thing, just a way of being. What that means is I can take little data, like a small set of data, and get big conclusions from it. The accuracy of those conclusions really depends on a lot of variables, but I can jump to big conclusions. So if my brain can identify 2 words out of the 40 that the lecturer is saying and then get the gist of it enough, then it literally won't hear the other 38 words. Mm-hmm. There's no way to make it do that unless we incentivize it in some other way. Mm-hmm. So these are arbitrary, which means all I'm really trying to do is read the professor and determine, based on what I know of them and my experience and whatever, what they think it is important that I get that and nothing else. But engagement, at least sometimes, what we're talking about is you now have an intrinsic reason to acquire this data. There's an actual problem you're trying to solve or something that you're going for that's not arbitrary, which means that the brain is incentivized to take in and pay attention to way more of the data being presented to it. I'm going to shut up now and let you say some stuff, because that's one element of it that I think is useful to look at.
Yeah, and someone in the comments brought up, yes, I get your point, but there are exams, and this is something that you brought up about assessment. Yeah. And in terms of practical considerations, especially thinking about higher ed, yes, in the vast majority of classes that you'll take, there will be exams. There will be an assessment structure that, on a very, very large sliding scale, will either match or not match the learning goals of that class. Right. Designing assessment is really, really, really hard. By and large, faculty are not trained in teaching and pedagogy. And I really mean that, like, little to no training at all.
Yeah.
So this is a hard question. So what do you do with a student who,
if we're talking about somebody who exists within the current framework as opposed to how the framework could or should be better? Exactly,
right. Yeah, because everyone is generally living in that world right now.
Right.
So what do you do? There are resources on most campuses that will be available to students who need support in other ways than they are getting in the traditional classroom. So at my institution, this would be something like the student support services or the student accessibility services. These offices will often do things like coordinate learning accommodations. So if a student had something like an IEP in high school, then a lot of those types of accommodations will carry over into the classroom.
Just some specifics on that is that there are not IEPs or 504s at the university, but you can utilize high school IEPs and 504s as documentation for whatever. Each university has its own process of how to allocate accommodations and resources. So if you have one, you can use it that way. And for people that it matters, testing, usually you want to be 17 or older when you get the testing done. A lot of universities won't take testing from earlier than that, but different places are different.
And faculty are required by university policy to abide by any accommodations that those offices put out. So if you're granted an accommodation, say for time and a half double time on exams, maybe a reduced distraction environment, those are probably the most common accommodations that I've seen in my personal experience.
Yeah, and one of them is very terrible usually. Yeah, but the other one would be good.
Then the faculty members have to abide by those. But if you don't have those accommodations set up through those offices, faculty are under no obligation whatsoever if a student comes in and says, hey, I need extra time on an exam because of XYZ. Faculty are, for better or worse, free to say no. So one thing that I would really strongly recommend is if this is something that you've dealt with in the past and you are getting ready to enter college, or you've maybe struggled in your first year, especially when it comes to like these large assessments, work with those offices. They are usually just fantastic. In my experience of the people that I've worked with. I have a fairly small sample size, but
I'll say that their intentions, the people are always fantastic. The process, not necessarily.
The process, not necessarily, but that's often outside of their control.
Right.
But recognize that a big part of what they do is to advocate for students.
Yeah.
So you can find someone on campus to advocate for you, and it might be someone in that office. It might be a faculty member that understands what you're going through and makes those accommodations for students on their own, even without being driven by these sort of formal accommodations.
Which is, I mean, pretty common.
Yeah.
A lot of professors, they don't give a crap whether or not you have the accommodations guarantee or, provided to you. They're happy to work with you. I mean, really what we're getting at, or hopefully what some people are moving towards at least, is that ultimate learning environment, the optimal learning environment is infinitely differentiated, meaning that each student is treated as is appropriate for that student as an individual. And again, there are practical limitations on that. But yeah, some professors will not give a crap. I try not to swear on the stream.
and honestly, I would say talk to people. So if you have a good support system at your college or university of people who have gone through or are going through the same things that you're going through or learn in a similar way that you do, talk to them. Get a sense of, this is not a good class for me because the way that learning and assessment is set up in this class just does not match up with how I learn and how I can demonstrate what I have learned. And don't take those classes, or don't take, or at the very least, don't take classes with those faculty members whose approach to teaching and learning doesn't align with how you learn. That's okay.
Yeah. How do you feel about Rate My Professor and things like that? Are those generally, I don't know much about them except that they exist. Do they seem to be useful, or just places people go to
I think they're the Yelp of higher education. Yeah. So you tend to get hugely bimodal information on there. So you'll get people on there who absolutely love their faculty members, people on there who absolutely hate their faculty members for, again, a variety of reasons, not all of which are under the faculty members' control.
The problem is with all of this. So all of this really goes under communication, right? The more that you communicate with people, many different people higher up in the hierarchy with more power, the better things are going to go for you. But the problem with all of that is the big term that everyone is always going to throw around is self-advocacy or self-advocate, meaning that when that system doesn't work, again, it's usually put back onto the student themselves when we say, they just need to learn to self-advocate, meaning they got to come up. Because even though professors, for example, are required to provide accommodations that have been determined as necessary and sufficient or whatever by the Office of Student Services, or they have different names at different schools, that doesn't mean that the professors are aware of those, and in my experience are very rarely aware unless the student themselves brings it to the professor's attention.
That is information that the offices cannot share with us.
Okay.
That is confidential medical information.
Yeah. So you have to still, you go through that whole process, but then you've got to go talk to the professor. And especially when we're talking about neurodivergence, autism in particular, but a lot of these things, dyslexia, the communicating is part of what is difficult because of those things. And there's the added thing of at 18 and older, parents are not allowed to support in this process, which I don't disagree with. I think that's good, but a lot of these students have not been able to do this kind of self-advocacy they haven't been trained for, or even if they have, it just doesn't work for the way that they work. Like the cost of sending that letter to the professor in the first place is more than just trying to stick it out and whatever.
Yeah, and this actually addresses or starts to address one of the questions in the comments about, what are the impacts of executive functioning skills, especially during the first year of college. And let me say, even for people who are not neurodivergent, executive functioning, pretty terrible.
Yeah.
For first year college students.
It is
which when you think about it is not surprising.
No,
at all.
It's a perfect storm. That's why we're putting all the criticism on the system and not on the individuals, because we're putting them in a position where we're asking them to do things that are not reasonable to expect people to do. And again, to me, getting philosophical, this all still comes back to the competitive nature of it, that what we're doing is setting it up deliberately so that some number of people have to fail. If everybody passed, then it has no value, which is kind of messed up. But talking about specifics, because the accommodations are great, communication is great, self-advocacy, all these things are very good. What I always talk to people about is starting at the point where you should start, which is figuring out why you're doing what you're doing. Because most people skip that part, especially when it comes to higher education. You just go to college because you're supposed to go to college, which is a ridiculous notion. It is not globally beneficial. We know that because we know many, many people who go to college and fail out and have terrible experiences. It's a thing that serves a purpose like any other thing. So the order in which things need to go is that you have to determine what it is you are trying to accomplish, especially for tasks, what we would consider eudaimonic tasks, meaning that they are not in and of themselves enjoyable or rewarding, but they are connected. You have connected them accurately or not to something that you do want later on.
And maybe just to butt in real quick, this doesn't mean you've picked a career. Right. And you've identified or even that you're going to school for this one major. That's I don't think that's what you mean.
No.
You could have very broad goals in the sense that I want to gain a diverse knowledge set through my 4 years.
I don't know what I want to do, so I'm going to go to university because I don't want to work, at whatever job I feel like I can get.
So we're taking a big umbrella, big tent version of what we mean by goals.
Right. And it can get very, very granular and specific as well, including okay, why am I taking this class, or why am I listening to this lecture?
Why am I doing this assignment?
Right. Because and one of the things that to me I find to be A, very simple and easy to do, and B, very impactful, but still very, very rarely done, is just tell the truth. Acknowledge the truth with students, because so many of them that are struggling know that a lot of what's being said is not true. A lot of the messaging that they're getting is not true on the face of it, but no one will acknowledge that with them. So they feel like they're the ones that are missing it, right? So all these things that we're saying, all these criticisms, kids will know that. Classic example, especially talking about math, why do we need to learn this? And the answer being, well, you won't always have a calculator on you. Which
terrible answer.
Right. Because even it's not true.
It's not true anymore.
But even when it was true, that's not an answer of why you need to learn this. That's just saying that you won't be able to rely on a calculator. But why do I need to know math? Give me, because again, the brain doesn't do anything without a reason. So it's fine in the current system to acknowledge that some things are just arbitrary. Arbitrary doesn't mean senseless or valueless. It just means that that's the way it is because somebody has determined that that is the way that it needs to be. There's often a lot of good reasoning behind arbitrary decisions, but it's arbitrary. So a simple thing that I'll tell people a lot, not good advice for everybody in every circumstance, but when you get that syllabus, sit down and go through and do the math. What is the grade that you need in the class? And then you chart out what is the easiest, most efficient way for you to do the bare minimum to get that grade. I know that's not a great thing to say in front of a professor. But see, it's because every professor thinks that their material is so valuable and important, and it is, but not to every individual. You guys being referred to as a service department is acknowledging that, right? They're here because they have to be here, which is, again, not how I think it should be, but currently is. Because one of the things about executive functioning tasks, I mean, this is why executive functioning is such a big thing of mine, is that even when people talk about it, they talk about it as a set of skills, as opposed to what it really is, which is the cognitive processes that manage resource expenditure for a person. So, for example, finals week is just the worst possible thing that you could design. If you were trying to design a way to make people have like breakdowns and lose all information they had gained in the previous several weeks, you would design finals week. There are finite resources. You only have so much you can do. Why would we ask everybody to do all their biggest stuff all at the same time? So when I'm saying do the bare minimum, I don't mean do that in every class. I mean, identify which classes it's worth you spending your extra resources on to get further into it, and which ones you just got to tick the boxes, and then figure out what those boxes are so that you can tick them. Mm-hmm. Because once you identify what you're going for, regardless, because sometimes it's, I'm saying bare minimum, sometimes that's the case, but sometimes it's no, I want to get as much information as I can while I have access to this professor and this, group or whatever. But you got to know what it is you're doing that for, so that your brain has, we call it priming. Your brain needs to be primed in order to identify which pieces of information are relevant and which are not.
And to be fair, this is something that I talk to my students about in most of my classes, that I recognize that you all have different goals for this class, and my class is not the only class that you're taking. You're probably taking 3 other classes. Those all are requiring some relatively similar amount of time. So I can't expect that you're spending all of your waking hours thinking about the material for my class. That's totally unreasonable on so many different levels. So it's up to you, and this is how I phrase it with my students. It's up to you to determine like where this class falls on your list of priorities. And that's not going to necessarily be the same throughout the entire semester. Like, and there might be some weeks that like this class is higher on the priorities, on your list of priorities, than it is in other weeks.
Yeah.
But what I really want my students to focus on is like, what are your goals for this class? Why are you here? What are you hoping to get out of this? And instead of framing it in terms of, because a lot of responses I get is, I just want to pass this class, which I understand.
Yeah.
But if I can flip that around and say, okay, what do you want to learn in this class? Why are you taking this class in the context of your other educational or just general learning goals? Okay. Yeah. And if we can align what your goals are in terms of learning for this class to what I've designed this class to do, then you're probably going to get something. You're probably going to get that out of this class.
Yeah.
One, because that means that when I have conversations with you, I already know what your goals are, and I can talk to you at that level, and we can work together on that level. When I don't know those goals, I just have to assume, right. And I might be right, but probably most often I'm not going to hit that nail on the head.
Well, imagine, and this is all great stuff because you're a great professor and you care and you put in this effort, and not everybody does. But that's part of it. Assess which professors are the ones that are going to be, that are going to be good return on investment in terms of like communicating with them about things that might make it more helpful for you.
And if that's the environment you want to be in, go to a teaching focused institution.
That's good to know. Mm-hmm. How would they evaluate for that?
So I think our listener who had this question is based in the Netherlands. I don't know as much about higher education, about the specific higher education system in Europe than I do about the US. But if you're thinking about the US, generally this is going to be schools that are formed in the liberal arts tradition. So if you are looking at, I would say don't look at college rankings because they're meaningless.
Do not look at college rankings.
But when you see those things come out, often you'll see things broken down into research universities versus liberal arts colleges. Liberal arts colleges are generally going to be smaller. From the faculty side, our tenure and promotion process is much different than it would be at a research institute, where there's much less emphasis put on research. At the very least, you're going to see equal weight put on teaching and research.
Mm.
At most liberal arts institutions, teaching is going to outweigh research contributions, which means the expectations for how you are spending your time and putting in your finite amount of resources as an employee of the college should be weighted toward teaching and learning.
Right. So like at some, like a research focused university, criteria for faculty might be something like you need to publish 2 articles in peer reviewed journals every 7 years or something like that.
Whereas at an institution like mine, saying you are making contributions to your profession.
Yeah.
And that's, again, taken in a very broad way. So what that means is those types of institutions tend to attract faculty members who want to have these sort of personal relationships with students where we're able to actually sit down with our students, understand their goals at an individual level, and make sure that we're actually trying to meet those goals in a classroom.
And the thing is that your job, that doing that is more costly than not doing that, right?
Yes.
But the overall job becomes much easier and more valuable if you do that first. It's just hard to get people to spend the resources up front, because what you're talking about is priming your brain, so that if you imagine it as, if I gave you a task to write an email to an unknown person in which you have to explain to that person, why they can't have some request that they want. Writing that email is going to be a monumentally difficult task because you don't know enough about what it is you're trying to do or who you're talking to. If I say write an email to this particular person for the same topic, it becomes much easier. So again, rather than having to generalize and teach to the archetypal like mental model of a college student in my class, you're looking and interacting with individuals, all the things that you said, right, that you can then shape what you're doing around them. Or like we say here, the reason I want people to talk in the comments, because if I'm just going to sit here and like talk for an hour, I have no idea what is going to be helpful or not. It's way harder than when somebody says, hey, I would like some help with this thing. We need, analysis paralysis, I'm sure is a term we've heard, the brain gets overwhelmed with too many choices. We need constraints. We can't pay attention to everything. So there's different ways to go about that. But one of the ones that we're talking about right now is to look at what is it you're trying to accomplish. First of all, is the thing enjoyable in and of itself, or is it only something you're doing in order to achieve some other purpose later? Again, accurately or inaccurately. You might think it accomplishes a thing when it really doesn't.
And for most people in my classes, the answer to the former is like not at all.
Yeah.
And
which most people will say about math, which is
this is by and large a phenomenon that is like relatively exclusive to math.
Yeah, I want to talk about that for sure. But I want to finish this, some stuff. There's a phrase, a quote from somebody. I feel like it's like a military person actually, but I'm not sure, that all failures of execution are actually failures of planning. You know who that's from? I feel like it's some general or something.
I have no idea who it is.
My pithy way of giving this framework is, desire, design, deliver. I got to get it like nice corporate-y sounding. Know what you want, then make a plan, then execute. If something goes wrong, then you work backwards. First, you look at execution. And if you can resolve it there, great. If not, you move upstream to planning. And if you can resolve it there, great. And if not, you move upstream to making sure that you know what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. It has to be connected to something, unless it is enjoyable in and of itself. And some things are both, obviously, right? Those are our favorite things to do. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you want to prime. So a specific example of this is if, for example, you have an assignment where you need to annotate a chapter of a book that you're supposed to read, and you've been given a graphic organizer. You go and read and study the graphic organizer first before reading the chapter, so that your brain is primed to know what information it needs to suss out as relevant. Otherwise, when you read, the brain is going to say, I don't know what of this is relevant, so I got to try and take it all in, which it won't be able to do, and you will get drained, and it will take forever, and you'll crap out on it. And over time, you'll just stop wanting to do it at all, unless you enjoy reading the book, which is great. But we teach this stuff backwards a lot of the time. We say, go read the chapter, then we'll talk about why it's important, which is nonsense. Again, it's that idea that only this is the important thing in your life. You don't need your resources for anything else. So know what you want, make a plan, execute. I would say, to me, the most helpful, useful way to look at execution and executive functioning in general is everything a person does, any person, is a result of the interactions between that person and the context that they're in, meaning that when execution happens, there's no conscious thought involved in that. You may have planned, you may be thinking things because part of the context is what is in your mind. But in that moment, you're not choosing to do a thing or not do a thing. So if it doesn't work, then the only thing you can do is try to get a different moment. So it kind of always goes immediately back to planning. But of course, that doesn't work so well when what we're doing is built on the premise of what matters is only the individual, which is really, I think, the rot at the heart of, what is it? Something's rotten in the state of Denmark.
Yeah.
That what we're saying is all these outcomes are purely based on an individual student and the things that they do and think and care about, which is just demonstrably, obviously not true. But it's a lot harder. It's a lot more inconvenient to acknowledge that that's not true. Anyway, so that's some specifics. And by the way, study, I'll just throw this one out there. People all the time will say, I got to study. And then you say, what does that mean? And they don't know. Nobody knows what that means. At best, they'll say something like, I got to reread the textbook or reread my notes, which typically is a terrible way to prepare for an exam. Sometimes it's a good way, but very rarely. So figure out what's the exam and then work backwards. What do you need to do?
Or if you really don't know the answer to these questions, go check out the whatever your university or college's equivalent is of, like a Center for Academic Resources. They'll have academic coaches who will teach you what studying actually means. What does it mean for you to prepare effectively for a given task? Yeah,
that given task is important.
There's no one size fits all for studying.
Yeah. Saying I have to study is like saying I have to work. Like, yeah. Okay, great, but what are you trying to do? And honestly, that's part of the reason that so many people who struggle to study in the first place struggle is because they don't know what to do. But then they fail or they struggle on the exam and they have nowhere else to put the blame except for on themselves. I should have studied more. And so the cycle repeats. They just keep trying this failed solution attempt.
When really the answer is, I should have studied differently.
Yeah. I mean, really the answer is we shouldn't be assessed in that way. But that's not practical.
Yeah. I've got so many thoughts about assessment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've talked a few times about the Goodhart, what is it called? Goodhart principle? No, phenomenon, whatever. The Cobra Effect.
Okay.
Which is that the moment that you select a measure as a measure, it ceases to be a useful measure. Uh-huh. Because theoretically, whatever you're selecting as the measure has some intrinsic connection to whatever your actual aim is. But the minute you select it as the measure, people are now incentivized to optimize for the measure, which disconnects whatever intrinsic connection it had, it no longer has. And it's sometimes called the Cobra Effect because a famous example of this is when the British colonial forces in India were having too many of their men getting sick and dying by being bitten by cobras. And so the theory they came up with is, well, we just need fewer cobras, then fewer of us will get bitten. And so what they did was they offered a bounty on dead cobras, thinking, makes sense, thinking that, we're incentivizing people to kill cobras, therefore there will be fewer, therefore we'll get. But what is it actually incentivized to do is not kill cobras, is present cobra corpses to the people who are paying you. And so what actually makes the most sense and what people did is start breeding cobras, because that's the easiest way to make the money. And then the British colonial forces realized what was happening, so they stopped the bounty, and now everybody had a bunch of cobra farms that were worthless and released the cobras into the wild, and you end up with more than you started with. I don't know why I think of that as like a mathematical principle, even though it's not really.
Well, there is a result in algebraic topology called the snake lemma. So
really?
Yeah.
Ooh, I want to learn about that. Because really that's where I want to talk with you most about, for just my personal curiosity and purposes, is the philosophy and like the deep specific domain knowledge between your field and mine, where a lot of this stuff overlaps. Mm-hmm. Because really the brain is just, my understanding of math, which is very, cursory at best, is that it is about the relationship between things. Like it's an exploration of how things relate to other things, mm-hmm. effectively.
Yep.
Which is basically what I do too, just we're using different like languages to approach it.
Yeah, and we do that within some specific logical or axiomatic framework. Yeah.
Which ours is also axiomatic. And in case anybody doesn't know, axiomatic just means that there are certain key pieces we have to accept because we just have to accept. We can't prove those pieces, but once you accept those, we call them axioms. Once you accept, go forward as though they are true, then everything else can be built off of those very few axioms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and question, math is about logic. I would say logic is a tool that is used in the study of mathematics.
Yeah, logic in terms of my field is, what logic means is that the conclusion follows from the premise in a reasonable way, is really all it is. Meaning that I can explain how I arrived at the conclusion from the premise. It does not have anything to do with accuracy, because faulty premises, or even accurate premises, but limited, like I'm seeing a certain portion of the picture, can logically lead to flawed conclusions. It's not like superior, when people are talking about, "Ooh, I'm rational and logical," like that's not a better way to be. It's just a subset of how we can go about connecting one thing to another. And it's really gated by language.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say that's true in any field of study. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody's got their jargon.
But
the math is maybe in some sense a little bit different because of the way the role that definitions have. The role of definitions in math is maybe a little bit different than definitions necessarily in other fields.
Mm-hmm.
So this question about like faulty premises leading to flawed conclusions, that doesn't really have the same effect in math as it would in say your field, because the idea of a flawed premise doesn't have the same meaning.
Right. Yeah, no, because in terms of math, like definitions are, there's a term for it. You said stipulated, meaning that there is definably a correct definition, and any other definition that somebody is using of that thing is incorrect.
In maybe another way to think about it is a term is stipulated in that the definition is given to you when that term is set out.
Right.
Versus
it means this and only this.
Versus when we think about the language that we use in everyday life, those definitions are extracted in the sense that people are using language. And then if you look at a dictionary, that dictionary hasn't set out what those words mean. That dictionary is describing how people are using that word.
Yeah, well,
that's an extracted definition.
Sure. And if you get into like linguistics, and you might know all this stuff, but for listeners, if you get into linguistics, there are many, many, many different kinds of definitions, including things like lexical definitions, which mean definitions that reference the point of view of the speaker, right? That the word "there" can only really be defined lexically, meaning that it is within a certain distance, but at least a certain distance from the speaker, kind of thing. Yeah, Brandon is very specific. I am very specific with words, because
so are mathematicians,
right? Because that's part of the value in math. So what we can do, and what we try to do here, is we acknowledge that language is used in different ways, and that literally there is no such thing as a word that means the exact same thing to two different people, because it's connected to different things.
Yeah.
But we can add definitions, and we can create our own stipulative language, here. So like, for example, I talk about, when I say problem, it means this specific thing, and I identify the specific variables that are necessary and sufficient in order for something to be a problem, and blah, blah, blah. Because, I mean, that's part of what I think is beautiful about math, that stipulative sense, is if you disagree about what a thing is, it just means that you're wrong, like, as opposed to,
or you're not talking about the same object. You're talking about a different object that is defined in a different way.
But if you're using the language for that different object, that is, incorrect. Yeah. Like if I were to say, I think 6 is a prime number, like, no, it's just not. Prime number means a very specific thing, and 6 does not meet that criteria.
Although math does have an issue with overloaded definitions, that that there are some words that are used in a wide variety of contexts that mean totally different things.
Well, psychology.
So one of the ones that you'll probably like this from psychology, the word normal is insanely overloaded in math.
Yeah.
Has very, very different meanings depending on what field of math you're studying.
Which, just so to be clear, in psychology, what normal means, what the word originally, it means most common. We then invest that with ideas of good versus bad, which is not at all the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we're getting in. I mean, I want to continue this conversation, but maybe that part of it we can do ourselves. Because I am a little curious, and I think this might be relevant because so many people who come for this kind of support will say, I'm bad at math, which lots of different elements there.
Yeah, you could do a whole hour unpacking that single statement.
Yeah.
Hear that a lot.
So I'm going to leave aside for right now the I'm bad at. How do we define, what do we mean when somebody says I'm bad or good at a thing? Because that's a whole thing. But let's just talk about math and why, because I have theories about why math specifically is targeted as the I'm bad at math more so than others. But I know you have more detailed theories. I'm curious about yours.
Well, I think probably a lot of it goes back to what we were just talking about in terms of how even just linguistically math is different from other subjects in the way that we are the precision that we use in the language and how you actually define terms and then use those definitions. The fact that math is a deductive science rather than an inductive one. All of the other things that would be considered natural sciences are really inductive sciences, because you're making inferences from data. So you are starting with some, and the philosophers out there will get mad at me for phrasing it this way, but generally you're starting with sort of very specific premises and generalizing to some larger conclusion from that. Whereas in a deductive logical system, you are starting with very sort of general premises and reaching specific conclusions.
Right.
Again, philosophers are.
I think of it as, building up or breaking down in a sense, right? And for me, a good mnemonic for this is think of Sherlock Holmes, because he uses the phrase deductive, but he actually does inductive.
Yeah.
He does know deductive reasoning. If it's I see this, induction is about I'm observing a thing, and I observe another thing, and I combine those things together to say, if that's the case, then this larger thing was probably also true. Whereas deductive is, I typically, because it could also start an observation, but typically deductive reasoning is more about, I am going to accept this premise, pretend as though this construct or whatever is true. If that were the case, what else would I then expect to observe?
Yeah.
And we talk about it a lot, actually, in terms of coaching versus therapy, because coaching is deductive and therapy can be either inductive or deductive, meaning if you have a great, a meeting that you think is real important and you miss it because you oversleep, that in executive functioning coaching, we only are deductive, meaning, okay, we're going to get more specific and observable. I overslept is a phrase that contains a lot of data, but let's get specific on that data. But in coaching, we're not ever going to build up to, it seems like you're self-sabotaging, which would be an inductive thing.
And I think this also kind of gets to this core about why we hear people say, oh, I'm bad at math, or the one you hear often, when I'm on a plane and tell people I'm a mathematician, I hate math. That's another big one is, I think this sort of logical structure that math embodies can feel very restrictive. And very rigid.
But see, don't you think that's a lot about how it's taught?
It's absolutely about how it's taught, because if you talk to a mathematician about what it means to do math, this is by and large not how mathematicians are approaching math. This is sort of the end result of a problem that we're trying to solve. Whereas for the vast majority of what we're doing, we're actually doing a lot of inductive work. We are actually doing a lot of sort of either mental or physical computational experimentation to try to gain insight and make generalizable statements. And once we have some intuition for what those things are, now we can move to this deductive step and say, okay, if this is what my claim is or my proposition, how do I prove it? Now I'm in that deductive sense. And a lot of mathematicians find a lot of value, and I think you would probably hear a lot of mathematicians call this, like, both facets of this, like, part of the beauty of math, are really drawn to that. But I think the way that, as you mentioned, math is taught tends to almost exclusively focus, especially as you get toward the higher levels of math, on this deductive structure.
Yeah.
Whereas the role of mathematical experimentation and honestly mathematical play is incredibly important to what mathematicians actually do. And I think not recognizing that focus in the classes that we teach is probably one of the reasons that so many people have this attitude.
Yeah, well, math is by and large taught through rote memorization. You know, it's taught as a series of distinct formulae, basically, and our job is to get you to memorize and be able to utilize it, to be able to identify when it is called for, and that's pretty much it. We don't talk about much else beyond that, which if we did that with any other thing, which by the way we do, we just don't do it to the same extent. Like this is so many people, probably people listening to this stream, loved reading when they were young kids and in middle school, and then hated it after high school, and they all put that on themselves, like, oh, I should get back to reading. Like, no, because we teach reading fiction deductively, so really in a lot of American high schools, where it's like, this means this, as opposed to the play. But really, like, there are many purposes to language, but if we're talking about semiotics and symbology and whatever, math or any other set of symbols is really in large part intended to, well, we're getting real philosophical and we're supposed to wrap up, so maybe it's a good time, but is intended to be able to come to conclusions, what we would call a priori, meaning, you know, by utilizing your thoughts, as opposed to a posteriori. A posteriori meaning you've observed the thing to be true. A priori means I know it's true because I can logically say that it is true, right? So it has to be inductive. There's no other point to it. What would be the point of just a system of notation of things that we are already observing?
Yeah.
But that's the way we teach it. And it's a terrible way to teach anything, rote memorization. Yeah. But how many of us can still say, like, you know, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, even if we don't use the Pythagorean theorem?
Sing the quadratic formula song. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really, I think, a lot more about the way that we interact with math than what math actually is, because what it is, people do that all the time. And one of the things, by the way, that I think is so great about, and maybe this is due to the stipulative definition thing, but maybe it's something else, I don't know, is that things are actually provable in math, because patterns are predictable, scaling out to my vague understanding, you know, like that I can prove that even though I'm not working every single case individually, because there are infinite cases, that it does not matter. You could choose anyone and it's still proven.
And here's the amazing part about this. There's one particular proof technique called proof by induction that essentially does this. What you're almost doing is you're saying, you know, we've got an infinite number of cases to prove. I'm going to prove that one of the cases is true. I'm going to prove that if one case is true, if any case is true, then the next one is true. So as soon as I prove that first one, it's like taking that domino, knocking the first one over, and all the rest of them fall. But this is not inductive reasoning. So it's called proof by induction.
That's funny.
So yeah, that comes up there as well.
That. Yeah, and I'll say, and we will wrap up before we just go off on all kinds of things. Ross's family is staying in town with us for Thanksgiving, so that's why we're doing it.
Go home and cook.
Yeah. That in psychology, or really like the social sciences a lot, or really just talking about morality or ethics or anything. So there's a term called heuristics, which is used mostly in a way differently than I'm about to use it. So I'll be clear that what I'm talking about is the brain has to make assumptions. We cannot pay attention to everything. So that's why the brain is a cognitive miser. We assume that everything we're not paying attention to does not matter. And we're wrong sometimes. And when we are, we learn, and we usually will then pay attention to that thing in future contexts. But it's the same kind of thing, is that what's happening with a lot of these things is that people arrive at conclusions through diligent work and play and exploration, but then they get to the conclusion and just share the conclusion. And then the conclusion gets passed and passed and passed until nobody remembers why it was originally created in the first place.
Process is the fun part.
Right. So when you get rules like, sometimes you got to let kids fail, which is, heuristics are useful and limited. The point of heuristics is to be able to navigate whatever thing is being navigated satisfactorily, not optimally, basically keeping you alive, more or less, right? So whenever somebody tells you a law or a principle or whatever about psychology or any of these things, just understand that there's utility there, or it wouldn't be something that is widespread. Like there's an exception to that, but generally speaking, things that are widespread are commonly helpful. There's some utility and there's limitations, and those things can exist together. We can say, yeah, that's great, except it doesn't cover this, because otherwise we get trapped in these things. What I see with I only really work with very basic math, high schoolers and stuff like that. But what I would see all the time is they approach a question, they don't have something come up in their mind as like, I've identified I'm supposed to use this process. And so then they say, therefore, I don't know how to do it.
Yep.
And I'm just going to guess, because they've been taught that it's that. You got to identify and then apply the correct process, as opposed to being like, no, it's still just numbers. There's only so many things you can do with those numbers. Like you can play around and figure stuff out. Same thing with psychology and morality and all these things is there are constraints. There are things we can do and things we can't do, and you can play around if the formula doesn't work for you for whatever reason.
And if you're interested in that sort of mindset, Dan Meyer has a great TED Talk. He's a math educator about problem solving in math.
I like that up.
A+.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us on the This Is Not Therapy Hour. This was fun.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have to do more. Yeah. Thanks for coming, Ross. Goodbye, everybody.